Okay, colleagues, let's settle down. I know we had a long day, but I'm sure it was productive. I want to thank colleagues for a successful day today, and it is my pleasure this evening to facilitate this last segment in our day. With me is Mr. Achim Steiner. As you know, he is the Executive Director for the United Nations Environment Program. And for those of you who are new to UNEP, just allow me a brief moment to introduce Executive Director Achim Steiner. Before joining UNEP, Mr. Steiner started his career at the Rural Regional Development Department of GTZ in Germany. From 1991 to 1997, he worked for the International Union for Conservation of Nature in Southern Africa and in Washington, D.C. He was also the Chief Technical Advisor of the Mekong River Commission before becoming the Secretary General of the World Commission on Dams. In 2006, Mr. Achim Steiner became or was elected unanimously by the United Nations General Assembly and became the Executive Director for the United Nations Program for a 4-year term, and he has served this mandate twice. Within the UN system, he has served in several capacities, including the head of UNAN. Finally, I would like to say that since my tenure as co-chair of the Major Group for Farmers, and this has been since 2013, Mr. Achim Steiner has never missed the opportunity to genuinely participate in the UNEP Global Major Group and Stakeholder Forum. So it'll be an honor if you can join me in introducing and welcoming Mr. Achim Steiner. We are in an open forum, and we will be taking your questions. I will kick off today's open dialogue by reflecting on two questions that came out of this morning's deliberations. The first is, what is the role of the private sector? We know that the private sector plays and continues to play since 2002 an important role in sustainable development, in providing resources. However, we feel as major groups that there has to be some sort of policy direction as to the role of the private sector in sustainable development within the UN system. The second important question that came out of this morning's questions and answer, which as facilitator I've been asked to put to you, Mr. Steiner, is the role of the UNEA in the HLPF process in New York. Those of you who are following that process, and many of you may not know about it, the two co-chairs have developed 3 clusters that focuses on poverty reduction. However, environment is mainstreamed. We feel, as major groups, that there has to be some statement or some lobby from UNEA through UNEP for a standalone cluster on the environment so that our work is not lost, and it provides a forum for the ministers of environment to continue working in the SDG process, particularly in New York. And so to kickstart our open dialogue session today, I pose these 2 questions to you. for feedback and comment. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Calvin, first of all, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon or good evening to all of you. Having followed through the live webcast parts of your forum today, I can only imagine that somewhere the prospect of having me sit here now for an hour with you may fill you either with trepidation or enthusiasm, but I'm told there is more to follow that is probably more physical in nourishment. So I hope you will bear with me, because I do actually very much appreciate the invitation to interact with you every time that you convene. I think it is both for UNEP, the Secretariat and Executive Director, another way of demonstrating also accountability to you as major groups, because you are very much part of the constituent forces that make UNEA come alive. And also I believe that very often when we try and strategize on these two questions that I'll respond to just now, there is a kind of front of the stage view of issues, and then there is that which goes on between meetings, behind scenes, in many of the platforms and arenas where these things play out throughout the year or between UNEAs. So let me first of all say it's great to have so many of you here. I think, as you will already have sensed, UNEA 2 has taken us a giant step closer to this vision of Rio +20, a strengthened and upgraded UNEP, but above all, a universal membership assembly. The numbers are going to test us all, and therefore I also seek your indulgence. We will have a very full campus here this week, but this is what UNEA is meant to be, and I want to thank all of you in particular for having made the journey here, because we live in some respects in a virtual world, but quite frankly, it does not replace being together here for a week and trying to give expression to this idea of having a world parliament for the environment. It may not be the perfect or even legally correct analogy, but to me it symbolizes something very important, namely that here in UNEA, it is not just an intergovernmental meeting that negotiates decisions. It is actually the world of environment that invites the rest of the world to come and talk about precisely what you alluded to in your question about the relationship between UNEA and, for instance, the High-Level Political Forum. Now, on the role of the private sector, first question one always has to ask, who is the private sector? In our conference rooms, we often think the private sector is a multinational, is a big corporation. But Calvin, turning to you, as a farmer, you're the private sector. You may be millions of farmers, and therefore, as millions of small farmers, you are very small individually, but collectively, you are very significant to what happens to land, to food, to water, resources, the markets that are out there. I think it is one of the advances in the UN that the major groups system has at least created a recognition that there is a multiplicity of actors outside government, and that also the private sector may be often equated to business as such, and then large business. But let's be very frank. In essence, it is everything that is outside the public sector and beyond the non-profit world, at least in terms of how our economies at least function. So for us to be able to relate to the private sector, to acknowledge its role, to critique it, to encourage it, I think is part of a multilateral process and setting. And I think discussions have over the years proven that this can produce also very fruitful results. Why is the private sector also so central to agendas such as the Paris Agreement, the SDGs? Let me give you a simple juxtaposition of two numbers. If the world were ever to come to the point where the Green Climate Fund would actually be funded at a level of $100 billion, and as you already know, that $100 billion is viewed by some governments as not exclusively public finance, but a mix of it. But let's, for argument's sake, assume for a moment $100 billion a year. Put that next to the $400 trillion a year that is the approximate value of our financial system at the moment. And then ask yourself, in the next 40 years, we want to literally reinvent our economies, from everything from energy, transport, buildings, agriculture, industry. If we cannot find a way in which we make, both through public policy but also through engagement, the private sector part of this pathway, then I think it does not take much imagination to understand of, or at least to recognize the risk of failure. One of the reasons why I believe we sometimes take so long in addressing the knowledge and science of, for instance, global warming or of persistent organic pollutants is that here is science and knowledge on the one hand, and here is a whole economy on the other. And it is not surprising that whether you call it vested interests, corporate interests, whatever it might be, that economy will be reluctant to shift unless you have an alignment of science, public opinion, public policy, legislation and norms. So to me, UNEA should have a lot of the private sector be part of it, because it is partly through the conversations and encounters here that we create the champions, whether it is back in business or whether it's in a farmers association or in a business association, that begins to take this conversation back into the boardrooms, into their constituencies, who rarely will either have the opportunity, feel comfortable, or seek the opportunity to sit in a discussion like this. So that's the first gain. Secondly, if you look at the global economy today, and it's true for virtually every national economy, that part of our economy that is transacted through the public sector, i.e. the percentage of expenditure in an economy that is actually public funding, rarely exceeds 20%. That means $8 in $10 are going to be spent, invested, transacted outside that so-called public sector domain. So again, another reason why we have to engage with the private sector. Now, in UNEP, I think we have always been very clear in our minds that there are different ways in which you engage in the private sector, and when it comes also to this debate about financing that you alluded to. I think to expect and to seek significant shares of finance in a multilateral organization like UNEP from the private sector is something I have never felt comfortable, nor did I consider it very realistic, nor do I think is it necessarily the answer to the shortfalls in funding that governments provide. We are a global public institution that is independent of corporate interest, independent of individual national interest, and is governed through a transparent process. Now, does that mean that from time to time we should not accept funding? No, I don't think this is a matter of religious boundaries, if you want. And I'll give you two examples where I think it has been very legitimate to do so. For instance, when we brought the banking, finance and insurance institutions together 20 years ago, we felt it appropriate, and this was before my time, but I wholeheartedly embrace the logic to this day, that in setting up the UNEP Finance Initiative, this should be a co-investment. Because on the one hand, UNEP needed to have its ability to have its own staff, its own representatives, and its independence in engaging with the private sector. On the other hand, many of the things that we would then set out to do to build capacity awareness amongst financial institutions was also a service. It was a service to the finance and insurance sector to come to terms with the emerging environmental science, what they needed to change. And so there has been a very successful partnership of co-financing a secretariat called the UNEP Finance Initiative that has allowed many, many good things to happen over the years, and I won't go into details now. But it's one example. Another one is when it came to the Niger Delta, and many of you who have attended our governing councils in the past will remember that there was a great deal of controversy when we, and I personally very much stood behind that decision, said that it would be a bitter irony if the costs of an environmental assessment related to oil spills and all that it involved at the time in the Niger Delta and Ogoniland were now to be funded by public taxpayer money. Many amongst the civil society movements were skeptical whether UNEP could actually sustain its independence and deliver an independent report when 2 or 3 companies were going to fund the total cost of this exercise. If you're not familiar with it, then let me just say the UNEP report on Ogoniland was delivered. It was never interfered with. UNEP was able to implement all of its work without any lobbying or interference either from government authorities or from the private sector actors. And I'm pleased to say, as you will hear in a few days' time, despite the very long and painful wait, but that is sometimes the reality, in a few days' time, the government of Nigeria, the federal government, the state government, the oil companies, UNEP, will finally launch the implementation of this report. And the companies have pledged and have guaranteed $1 billion for the first phase of the cleanup. So here is another example where it is appropriate for an institution like UNEP to say, who foots the bill? And if it is done in a transparent and accountable way, I think very legitimate. A last brief example, the Enlighten initiative. As you know, efficient lighting is something that is not only dependent on companies being able to put new technologies on supermarket shelves, it depends partly on public and regulatory measures. And so a few years ago we joined up with the GEF, 2 or 3 private sector companies, to have a project that would simply offer to governments a service of lessons learned and best practices of how they could accelerate the phasing out of inefficient lighting and create the conditions in the markets for more efficient lighting. And we co-financed this advisory and capacity building service of interest to us in UNEP because the faster we could phase out old incandescent lighting, the better. Of interest to companies because if governments could make these markets grow faster, they could sell more products, but not only they, all the other companies in this field. And thirdly, from the point of view of national governments, it was a way to not be able to depend on one source of advice, because this was a team that was working in a joined-up effort. So I hope in giving you these 3 examples, I can explain to you of how we in UNEP are not trying to fund the implementation of UNEP's work program from private sector funding. But every now and then, there is both an opportunity, a rationale, and sufficient transparency and accountability to make such funding, co-financing, what it usually is, legitimate, effective, and useful. But from the point of view of the broader Sustainable Development Agenda and also the Paris Agreement, colleagues, I think we all have to begin to rethink our perspectives on actors of yesterday and actors of tomorrow. If the private sector, including the financial and capital markets, investors, funds, are not able and willing and ready to invest in this agenda, there will be no 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I would challenge any one of you to prove the opposite. I can't prove it either yet, so we're both in hypothetical form, but I think I have at least a great deal of evidence that I just try to give you a couple of indicators of why it is fundamental that that world of the private sector, from the owner of the corner shop to you as an individual person who walks into a supermarket and buys something because you're part of the market, to the global multinational that has to invest in new technology generations. And so when you look at the work that we do today, for instance, on the issue of green finance, I think it is probably in the history of UNEP the most significant impact that it will have in terms of quantitative scale. On the one side, we work with the UNEP Finance Initiative on, in a sense, getting the financial institutions ready, because it's remarkable how sometimes uninformed they are over the counter when they provide advice, or even in looking at where green finance could emerge. Today, UNEP is part of advising the G20 through the Green Finance Study Group. We are working with central banks around the world, and we are accelerating the scope for people to not put their money into yesterday's economy, but actually into tomorrow's economy. So herein lies, to me, the, let's say, perspective with which to look at private sector and its role in SDGs and also in climate change. And I could give you dozens of examples. I'm sure many of you in this hall could also come up with them. So let me leave it at that for the moment and happy to answer questions. Now, the role of UNEA and HLPF. I think we all should take 2015 as a remarkable breakthrough, and I think little debate about that. Remarkable things have happened, including, having the environmental dimension truly now woven throughout these, sustainable development goals that traditionally would have been in some kind of hierarchy of what matters really and what should be looked at if we can afford to. That has changed. It is also universal. It is integrated. I think we have a remarkable number of years ahead of us. What I imagine your question, however, is alluding to is, and I've deliberately not used the term mainstream, I do not view the SDGs as a way of having mainstreamed environment. I have lived for 25 years in this narrative of mainstreaming, and I think what you are also alluding to is that when you get mainstreamed, you can also get sidelined. So let's be very clear. In the design, in the DNA, if the triple helix, as I often quote Angela Cropper, of the SDGs, I don't think that argument stands the test of scrutiny. The environment is there. It's central. It's woven throughout it. It has indicators, and you can now look at the number of goals and number of indicators where the environment is a defining element. The question is what happens next. And I think here you are rightly concerned that the world hasn't just changed overnight between 2015 and 2016, and so we always have to remind ourselves 2030, the agenda, the SDGs, they are aspirational, and what they're suggesting is that we will move from A to B, and that move hasn't happened, and whether it will happen, how quickly it will happen, I think now indeed depends on a very focused effort to keep the SDGs honest, to keep governments accountable, but also ourselves. And this is where I sometimes nowadays hesitate. We want to have environment at the top of the agenda. We want environment to be central. Then the next constituency comes, no, it's people who are the center of the SDGs. And the third one comes, no, it's poverty that is the center of the SDGs. And here comes my first caution. I think we all have to carefully think about, are we also going to go back to the same thing, that we want to have the environment at the top of the SDGs? Because then we're already unraveling the very logic that has led to this change in approach. I think we also need to now carefully study what is playing out in the process of constituting the high-level political forum. First of all, the high-level political forum is growing in that New York environment. And New York is unique. It has a different set of laws of gravity under which it thinks it operates. And so the first thing must be to bring the voice of environment very clearly into the New York arena, permanent missions, meetings, General Assembly, ECOSOC, in order to ensure that the agenda, the process by which HLPF and ECOSOC and ultimately the General Assembly will deal with this agenda is not unraveled again. But I'm not sure that the answer is to fight for the environment to be at the top of the agenda, or to have a cycle in which, for a period of time, it is the environment that will be the focus. I think you have to, if you're going to argue for that, come up with a rationale of how does that sit alongside those who want poverty, health, economic development, access to energy. Because otherwise we are back to just being another stakeholder group or another agenda. Environment is foundational to the SDGs, and our challenge now is to articulate a strategy, a tactic, but also an engagement agenda to make the SDGs stick to what they were designed to deliver. And I believe that what you can do as major groups is to make sure that this new assembly gets courage and believes in itself. I'm astonished sometimes at how timid many are in actually saying, this is a United Nations Environment Assembly. This is not some outfit that operates outside of where politics really matters. No, here in Nairobi, every 2 years, the world of environment and those who have something to do with it will be the authoritative voice. They will set the agenda, and New York must listen to it, and HLPF must listen to it as much as UNEA will speak to the HLPF, ECOSOC, and the General Assembly. Now, this is a political process, so don't expect the doors to just be thrown open. But I think what you can do this week here is to say to governments, take your role and mandate seriously. Heads of state and government didn't establish a universal membership assembly in Rio in order for you to continue to transact a governing body of UNEP or a governing council with just more people. The significance of what UNEA can articulate and how it then also takes it into the broader arena, I think will in large part answer the challenge of what some call mainstreaming or then being sidelined. And I think if you look at the agenda here this week, there are plenty of issues on which UNEA should pronounce itself more clearly, more ambitiously, and also with an advocacy perspective towards the broader arena. I won't mention them now because otherwise I'll get into trouble, but I'm sure you know what they are. And I would only urge you to work both on the substance, because if UNEA can speak clearly, competently, and authoritatively on issues, the next step is already taken. New York will have to receive that message. And then comes the second stage of how you engage in the political process with HLPF and the other fora in New York. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much. The floor is now open. I will take a cluster of questions. I see my colleague to my left, then my colleague right in front of me, and the young lady across here. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Steiner. I'm Sam Nada. I'm from Egypt. I'm the Executive Director of Arab Office for Youth and Environment, and recently became the chair of Jeff CSA network that you are aware about. So I'm just trying to get through what we had this morning about partnership, talking about private sector. Actually, we have to admit that the environment now and the world became very wild and faster than the plans that we are doing since 30 years ago. I'm working in the environment 25 years ago, and I know that we are getting worse, we are not getting better. So the partnership now became a must, because the stakeholders' involvement became the only way that we have to get through, not the private sector only, but the stakeholders' involvement. And they have to insist that by UNEA, that you have to put these innovative ideas of how to get the people inside the decision-making and implementation. Otherwise, I don't think that the number of disasters that we have now is getting a result or giving an indicator that we are facing really every day a disaster. Yesterday, I came from Egypt by Egypt Air, and in one piece, thanks to God that I came. But the second thing that I had in BBC after this disaster, that in India, the temperature reached 51 degrees centigrade. So it means now the governments are not the only in charge to get this. And I think that from UNEA, we have to get this as a real step to real extraordinary thinking about how to involve people, regardless of CSOs or others, but even indigenous people, to get through and to have many cooperative work to save the environment. Otherwise, there is no country will be out of disaster. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just by way of protocol, could you give your name, the organization you represent, and please keep your questions concise so that we can get as much in this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. My name is Ayo Olukoni. I retired career and foreign service officer, and I ended up after 35 years as the Nigerian High Commissioner to Australia with concurrent accreditation to New Zealand, Fiji, Papua New Guinea. I was also lucky to have been serving the permission in New York. 1988, when the Bernard report came, and I had the privilege of working with you, Mr. Achim Steiner, when I was acting PAM rep to UNEP and UN Habitat. It's good to see you. I'm very happy. Thank you for what you've done in terms of the cost of the environment. After 35 years, half of which I served on the international development process, was part of the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste, the Bali Strategic Plan discussion, the Financing for Development process, the CSD in New York. It means that some of us have also been on the theoretical ground in terms of putting this in. I'm now retired, I'm pensioner, and I'm involved on environment issues on ground, practically. And that's where my question is coming from. Because when I mention the question of environment, I serve as the vice chair of Fight Against Desert Encroachment. When I mention the question of the environment, people are yet to understand it. The whole issue of environment being new conditionality has moved a little bit away, but how do we get the message across? I was part of the discussion for the Governing Council to transfer from the UNEP. Thank God we have the UNEP. I would want you to share with us from your own practical example in terms of what exactly is happening. Because some of us are engaged with the private sector in terms of the question of having a new narrative in the banking sector to fund small little microfinance thing on ground. You want to share experience with us? I'm here with one of our professors in terms of practical initiative. I also want to ask specific questions. One, in terms of the SciChem initiative, the strategic approach to international chemicals management, then the outcome of the conference on at the 54th session of the International Atomic Energy Agency, because I served as acting PAM rep to UNEP in Vienna, where the question of cancer in developing countries was taken on. And what is the effect? Here, COP8, Basel Convention, electronic waste, what has been the result? How have these companies, the private sector itself, like you said, you've expanded the frontiers of the private sector in terms of, I will appreciate if you can let us know practical, because we want to go back home and not talk about it again, but walk the talk. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to see you once again. We thank you for what you've done for environmental sustainability, but the future, of course, as far as that is concerned. So for our understanding, so that our people can buy into it. The last one is Agenda 2063, UNEP, in terms of practical initiative. I'm sorry, it's a potpourri of questions and comments, but thank you very much for what you've done for us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Final question before Mr. Steiner answers.
Thank you, Susan Brown from WWF International. One question, one observation. I'll start with the question and ask you, you've been in this game for a very long time. I was surprised when I looked through the resolutions coming into the UNEA at how many battles we need to refight. And I must say, I'm asking you for a little bit of wisdom here in terms of those of us who are getting a bit impatient just seeing refights over and over on climate, on sustainable development goals. We all went through 2015 together. Can you give us some advice if you're asking us to do more advocacy? We've done loads of it. How much more do we need to do, and how can we do it so that we can actually move on to really good implementation of the agenda with the member states? My second is an observation. Achim, you've done a brilliant job, and I really wanted to say that publicly. You've done it with warmth, with wisdom, with intelligence, and you and your team have worked with us with respect and with love, and I wanted to thank you.
Okay, so we will take a second round as soon as Mr. Steiner has finished these cluster of questions.
Well, at this point, I should actually say I have to run to a meeting because it can only get worse from here, isn't it, Susan? But thank you very much for your kind comments. And, you know, I have always viewed myself as part of a community. And, you know, for 10 years I have been put onto this chair. But let me say, all of what I and my colleagues do here very much grows out of the work that you do. And in return, I hope we have managed to make your work also easier. So I'll start from the reverse because it goes straight back to your first question. You know, it is so difficult to rationalize this slightly schizophrenic universe that we face. My first take is, if you're an environmentalist in 2016, you should actually be really excited. And I think in part you would gain that by having a little bit of a historical perspective. I've often in the last few months thought about and read up some of the speeches and the work of my predecessors here, because two of them, as you know, passed away, both Morris Strong and Mustafa Tolba. And, you know, I think we sometimes forget where they began this journey, you know, whether in their own right or then in their capacity as UNEP. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, if you were an environmentalist, you were either viewed as somebody who, you know, just has the wrong priorities or is just misguided or ideologically lost. You would not be invited into conference rooms, you would certainly not be in boardrooms, and if you were put on television, it was usually as an exotic specimen. You know, the environmentalists, I mean, the economists took the better part of my entire grown-up adult life to stop referring to environmentalists as, leather-sandaled muesli eaters or something. It is extraordinary how long that journey has been for us as a community of professionals, whether advocacy-oriented or science-oriented, to be acknowledged, and secondly, to be recognized also as legitimate players in the center stage. I think 2015 is a year that we need to celebrate, and not to make things look better, and not to deny, and I'll come to your point in a moment, that on all the major metrics, our world is still pointing in the wrong direction. But, you know, our work today is in one sense so much easier, and people paid with their lives, and in some countries still do. But more often than not today, if you are an environmental practitioner or an environmental NGO or an environmental scientist or official, you no longer have to use a crowbar to get into the room. You are part of the conversation. In the SDGs, I think you have to, for a moment, you know, pinch yourself and say, this is the result of 4 decades of trying to move something that was considered to be a pillar or a dimension or something that will come when we have time and money, to now being center stage. And also the issue of climate change. Now it is called an economic issue, a development issue, a security issue. Well, guys, it was an environmental issue for as long as the mainstream didn't want to take note of it. And it is, to this day, to me, an environmental change phenomenon that has literally redefined how our economies will look 50 years down the line. And the Paris Agreement, you know, cautious and, you know, as a milestone and as a stepping stone, and certainly not guaranteeing us a 2-degree world, nevertheless wrote down for the first time with the signatures of heads of state and government that we are going to decarbonize our economy in the next 60 years. Now, to us sitting here today looking at what's happening, you know, out there, it may seem an absurd notion. But remember what they said about the first computers when they were invented, and, you know, how they would be a relic of history and never really be taken serious. So I think we have designed ourselves today into the center of what is happening in our societies and economies. And from that vantage point, I think we have to rethink our strategy also. I think to be an environmentalist in the year 2016 or 2020 is something very different, or will increasingly be very different. And we always have to acknowledge there are some people who are actually fighting for the right to even have access to water or land, or to close down a factory that is killing their communities. So there is that end of the spectrum. But at the other end of the spectrum, we need to also understand is that we can't run the world better than everybody else, and will do so on behalf of everybody else. We have to learn to understand that how do we change the future of agriculture? Something that I personally am extremely preoccupied by. I think it is almost a more serious challenge in terms of time pressure than the transition towards a low-carbon economy now. Can we simply do it by making ourselves into organic farmers and believing that we can replace the entire food system on the planet? No. We have to begin to engage with, first of all, the reality of food production on our planet today. We have to begin to work with the reality, like it or not, that, for instance, the seed trade is controlled by 12 companies, and actually, you know, half of it by just 3 or 4. What is the tactical and strategic engagement approach that we would choose? Because standing outside, the building or the annual meeting of a company is part of the strategy. But I think we need to go much further, much quicker. I think the second challenge for us is that we live in a time that is so unprecedented, and here I come to your point. You may have heard me speak about the Anthropocene or perhaps written about it before. I think to me why I have been so captivated by this notion of living in the age of the Anthropocene, i.e. the age where humans have become a dominant factor in the way that our planet literally evolves, is that it speaks to something that is unprecedented. With 7 billion people, we are changing life on Earth, our life support systems, on a scale and at a pace unprecedented in human history. And one of the challenges we face is that neither our consciousness, nor our imagination, and from there our institutional architecture, or our sense of urgency has actually kept pace with the developments that we're faced with. And I think in part, to me, that explains this continued, largely negative trend that we still see on all the major metrics when it comes to planetary health. But herein lies something that I've had to constantly remind myself, because sitting in a global organization, if you look at things globally all the time, you have to be careful that you don't lose sight for the local, the national, the specific. And the only reason why I sit here today and don't look perhaps even 10 years older than I do is that I'm actually quite excited. Because the thing that I have enjoyed the most about being the executive director of UNEP is that wherever I have gone, every country and every encounter, I have met people who are actually doing it differently. And I think there is an extraordinary amount of activity building underneath that curve of global statistics and national statistics that is beginning to make me believe in turnarounds and turning points and thresholds. And those thresholds can be negative ones in ecological terms, but they are also the kind of turning points where, when I go out sometimes today even, people don't believe me when I say that more than half of all investment in new electricity power generating infrastructure last year was renewable. They just don't believe it. And I have to cite Bloomberg News in order to get some kind of credibility with them, even though they don't know that we have been producing the Sustainable Energy Investments reports for the last 7 years together. Now, that is a turnaround. And for your own mental sanity, I would say celebrate those also, because first of all, they're good for your psyche. Secondly, they're good for our community, because if everything we ever talk about is how we have not managed to do something, we will all get lethally depressed. Secondly, we actually don't recognize where we are succeeding and where we're having breakthroughs. And, there are many of them. The phase down of ozone-depleting substances, the phasing out of lead in fuels, the now under-process phasing out of lead in paints. The fact that when I arrived in Nairobi, there was fuel being sold here at the petrol station with 10,000 parts per million of sulfur because of one refinery in Mombasa that made the entire East African market a dumping ground for the world's oil markets to dump the dirtiest fuel they couldn't sell anywhere else. That refinery closed 3 years ago. The East African countries finally are liberated, and within just 3 years have moved from 5,000, where they had brought it down to now 500 and soon 50 parts per million of sulfur and fuel being sold here. Kenya, 50% geothermal power. Ethiopia, Morocco, South Africa, Ghana, the countries that didn't even feature on global renewable energy investment statistics 5 years ago, are now amongst the fastest growing players in this field. Germany, when was it somebody tweeted today? Yesterday, 93% of its electricity produced by renewables. In fact, Denmark and Portugal, I think, did the same somewhere in the last few weeks. Okay, just for a few hours. But, when the first computer came out, nobody would believe that we'd be sitting somewhere in the Masai Mara and could have the entire world library at our fingertips. Bertrand Piccard and André Boschberg are flying solar impulse. People think, flying with solar panels, it'll never happen. They're doing it, and wait, let's see what happens in 20 years' time. And I could go on with many of these examples. So there is a reality that I don't want to deny here. If you are a community that is being displaced, being poisoned by, an extractive industry or by an industry, that doesn't make any difference to you. But the number of communities that over time we can protect from these kinds of threats, I think, is going to grow, has grown. Another great example that I feel personally very proud of, not in my contribution because it was minimal, but in terms of UNEP and member states and President Obama, is the Minamata Convention. Finally, and I went and we were there when we had the diplomatic conference in Minamata, where people are still suffering from that Minamata disease today. If you had seen the pride in their eyes that we had come there with the Minamata Convention and the international community to finally not correct the injustice that happened to them, but to do the second best, which is to make sure that this would not happen to another community in the future, then that's another victory. So please maintain a perspective. The overall curve is still very troubling, but what's building underneath it is an exponentially growing curve of actually being able to demonstrate that we will succeed in doing things differently. And here I come to IU, and indeed it is very nice to see you here again in Nairobi. You refer to SAICM, to the Basel Convention, also Agenda 2063. Many of these are, and if you want, the superstructure that we are building in order to be able to make these turnarounds happen faster. Now, they don't in themselves guarantee it, but they are vehicles. And I think whether, people say Agenda 2063, Agenda 2030, you guys are just setting goals and these goals are never realized. My first point is if you don't set yourself goals, you don't even know what you're aiming for. Secondly, because you fail to achieve them doesn't make the goals wrong. The strategy may not have been right, or the time was not right. Let's be honest, sometimes times are more conducive in terms of national parliaments or in terms of not having a financial crisis, which seems to be a perpetual reason nowadays not to do anything. I'm not sure whether it is still the same financial crisis of 2008, the next one, or already the fear of the next one coming. But that's, global economics. What I think is extremely important is that we recognize this exponential growth of problems. 7 billion people from 1 billion people in just 300 years. I mean, we have to for a moment figure out that this is a game changer. Producing food for a global middle class as opposed to, smallholder subsistence farming communities is a game changer. Mobility. When people in their billions start traveling and in their millions start air travel, again, the increase in pressures are so unprecedented that with all the progress we're making, we're constantly still losing on the global indicator. So I think we also have to learn to tell the story. And in fact, as you know, we just released the Global Environment Outlook regional reports. And I was very interested to see how would the regions describe their view of environmental change and threats. And the first thing is they don't describe it in identical ways, which is the first very reassuring part, because each region actually, through the geo-regional approach, has now begun to articulate a more concrete and directly relevant view of its state of the environment. But secondly, also the answers and the strategies being pursued are different. And I think herein lies also our challenge as a global organization. We need to tell the world that in overall terms we are threatening our life support systems as never before, and we are actually increasing the pressures if you take them in a totality. And at the same time, it is our duty to not pretend as if nothing that we have tried in the last 10, 15, 40 years has not worked. Air quality is still a problem, but compare air quality in an industrial region such as Germany or in the eastern part of the United States or indeed in Japan from 35 or 40 years ago, urban air quality to today. They are improved. We are actually restoring ecosystems. We're expanding forest cover again. that is, I think, the challenge of our time, recognizing that we live in an age that is unprecedented in terms of escalating pressures, and that is part of the reason why we can't say we've managed to solve the problem. But at the same time, don't underestimate also the momentum that we have built and that is gaining, I think, rapidly in speed. And Paris, therefore, is not an accident, nor is it an illusion. It is a very real testimony to something that is changing. So I hope that I've touched on this. I haven't covered, for example, e-waste in particular, but it falls into the same narrative. 1 billion cell phones. I mean, who would have thought 20 years ago that we would be buying 1 billion cell phones every year? Which means 1 billion cell phones are going somewhere into the dustbin or into the drawers. What we did with the International Resources Panel is say, okay, we all want cell phones and we also want the latest cell phones, even if it's, you know, a great gimmick that we fall victim to, that every year somehow this thing becomes so much greater that we have to buy one. We have worked over the last few years with the electronics industry to influence how design engineers take recyclability into account, because this is simply an oversight. If they had thought beforehand in the design of these cell phones that you actually also provide for easier recyclability of all the metals and gold and silver and so on that is in there, then the cost of recycling would be a fraction. This is what I often mean when we need to, in our understanding of environment, not only fight electronic waste, we need to go up the supply chain, ask ourselves, where do we actually stop the problem from even becoming one? And you know, we have been far too shy, or maybe sometimes intimidated by the world out there, that we can't do this. And I think the opposite is true.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we are going to take another round of questions. I see Peter, my colleague, Doreen, behind Doreen, to the back, and then on this side. Peter.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Peter Denton. I'm Regional Representative for North America, and my organization is the United Church of Canada. Achim, I wanted to appreciate just how much you have led a sea change in UNEP since Governing Council 27. I've been privileged to watch how you helped to put feet on the resolutions at Rio Plus 20. And while an organization takes a lot of leadership, it's really not by accident that we are here, it's by intention, and I really wanted to appreciate those kinds of changes. We did have a conversation back in 2013 about the invisibility of faith-based organizations or the faith community, despite their role on the ground in communities around the world. And I've been astonished to see how quickly that has also changed in the way in which UNEP has looked at these things, with the appointment of Rosemary Mukasa and responsibility for that, watching you welcome Pope Francis, and then being privileged a month ago to hear your comments in Tehran at the Second International Seminar on Environment, Religion and Culture that was co-sponsored by UNEP and UNESCO as well as the government of Iran. And we had an open, wonderful dialogue across all kinds of boundaries and barriers and in ways that I think everyone was quite astonished to embrace. And I'm wondering, in light of that, and if you would like to share comments on what that experience was like for you, because there's only a handful of us here who heard you, that do you think that the implementation of the 2030 agenda opens the door to new and real partnership with faith-based organizations around the world toward decision-making in UNEP as well as implementation of its programs on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you, Calvin. My name is Marcos Orellana with the Center for International Environmental Law, CL. In the last forum, the representative of the World Resources Institute, not Carol, but her boss, Lalanath, asked quite pointedly, how could UNEP have come up with such a poor access to information policy? And the answer, well, part of the answer was, well, it's a one-year provisional policy that would be subject to test runs, and during that year, it was subject to oral written consultations, experts' comments. A new policy has been set in place, which is undoubtedly much, much better. It comes close to good governance at international standards. And I mentioned this anecdote because it shows that engagement leads to positive results, engagement with stakeholders in substantive policy areas such as access to information. And this leads then to a question. A few months ago, UNEP convened a meeting in New York with big environmental non-governmental organizations jointly with IUCN. Some observers have interpreted this meeting as an expression of frustration of UNEP with the major group's approach, especially since the elected representatives of the NGO major group were not invited to participate in the meeting, not even as observers. Since Rio+20, there has been significant, rich discussion on stakeholder engagement. There has been even an expert group convened by you as executive director to advise, to provide recommendations on this issue. There have been consultations, there have been negotiations at the intergovernmental level, and now we have a draft policy that is at portas of being adopted. And so the question is whether you think it is sufficiently robust, whether it would fulfill paragraph 88 of the Rio+20 document, whether the silent veto, sometimes framed as a non-objection principle, would it fatally undermine the policy, and perhaps most importantly, would it enable meaningful participation in the new UNEP? Thank you.
I'm Noreen Kennedy, representing business and industry to UNEP, and I just wanted to add my thanks to you, Achim, for all you have done, and there has been tremendous progress here in this House. You've been a catalyst for it, and I think a substantial part of that has been the extent to which you have brought innovation, both innovation in terms of the more traditional understanding of technology and know-how, but also innovation in terms of institutional innovation, which is really critically important, especially because now we're in a post-Paris world, and yet we're still, I think, in many instances, working with one another in the pre-Paris way. I noticed that in coming UNEA, we have the Sustainable Innovation Expo running kind of separately from the actual intergovernmental discussion, but could you comment about how you see innovation playing out inside the UNEA 2 discussions? I mean, it's really a critical factor. I can just reflect myself that in working with an extremely broad business community across sectors, sizes, nationalities, there's one issue that unifies everyone, and that is innovation and enabling innovation. And certainly I think one of the major reasons why the business community has become so seized with sustainability, the reason why you saw thousands of business people in Paris last year all pointing in exactly the same direction, was the promise and opportunity of innovation for every industry sector. So I'd just be interested to hear your reflections about how you see it in the near term in terms of these next 5 days ahead of us, but also for the future of this important institution. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Kalyani from Women's Major Group. I think the major group mechanism has been the best in the SDG process because it has provided a lot of opportunity for engagement and from different sectors. Having said that, I'm a bit worried about the private sector encouragement in the entire process because as we know, there can be human-based development as well as environmental-based development, and sometimes both. And in the past, we have had instances where the private sectors has been more focused on the human development at the cost of environment or at the cost of environment exploitation. So I'm a bit worried about how UNEP is going to take this private sector, which my engagement ahead, because there's a very thin line between the growth and the development. And when you are looking at the SDG implementation process, so the private sector could be more growth-oriented than the protection of environment, having it in the overall mind. So I would just like to know how UNEP is going to take that process forward. Thank you.
Okay, and final question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
My name is
Oh,
Juliet
sorry.
Makoha from Sustainable Environmental Development Watch in Kenya. I represent also the major groups, particularly the women. Thank you, Director, to have taken all this time to be with us. My concern is that we do have companies that are producing plastic bags, and they are actually a menace in the country, especially when there is too much rain, like now. What is UNEP going to do so that the companies that produce the plastics can change to have paper bags, which we used to have in the 70s and 80s, and the country was not in a mess as it is now because of plastics? My second question is about companies that are introduced in the villages. We had one company which collapsed due to very many environmental reasons, and now that company is going to be revived. It's a paper mill company, and environmentally that company was also a hazard to the community around, because people developed various diseases. You could see children with very funny skins, and we expected the environmental or public health to come in and tell the community what is happening. And now this company is going to come again. What is going to happen? Has the environmental assessment been taken to allow the company to continue? Is UNEP monitoring to see that as this company comes back, we don't mind creating employment, but are we going to have employment just because of the company coming back, or it will be a company using proper chemicals that will not cause hazard to the community? Thank you, Director.
All right, thank you, colleagues. Mr. Steiner.
Let me start with my Kenyan sister, because I think what you are alluding to, touches on virtually every question that we had asked. How do we move ourselves from a world in which so much is going wrong to a world in which a lot less goes wrong or a great deal more goes right? And I think, this paper mill is an interesting illustration. I can't comment on the individual project because I know of it, but I'm not familiar with it. But what I would say to you is, I think UNEP, first of all, has this challenge that we have, a world of 193 nations, 7 billion people in theory, and an environmental mandate that we must meet. And our greatest strength is often not to stand by the side of a community and battle over a particular project. And, maybe we would do more of it if we were 10,000 instead of 800 in the Secretariat, or 850. But I think very often many national organizations, community organizations, and parliamentarians are in the end going to be the more effective allies to a community, not to be put back in that situation. Where UNEP becomes relevant, and you just gave me, an opening on that, is, for instance, on chemicals. Rotterdam and Stockholm is about a very frail attempt to try and get chemicals out of our economies that we know not only harm the environment, but makes people sick. What I don't know, and I would throw that challenge back to you, because I think this is something that the major groups and governments need to start thinking about. We can't go on trying to address this issue of when science tells us something is dangerous and harmful to us, that we then spend 10 years negotiating a protocol, a convention, an agreement, and then establish a whole process around it. We have 100,000 known chemical substances theoretically available to us to be used today. Are we going to have a convention for each one of them? No. I urge you to think because this is where UNEP can become relevant, because if we can globally agree that these chemicals, unless they are proven and certified, should not be sold in the global marketplace, we can prevent also that paper mill from having access to that chemical. And that's where UNEP becomes relevant. Unfortunately not probably in the debate about whether the EIA was done properly, but I think you also alluded to things like plastic. You know, I've lived in this country and I know that Kenya already passed over, I think it's 12 years ago, legislation that in principle was going to phase out thin film plastic bags. To this day it hasn't happened because somebody is, you know, obviously having a remarkable persuasive power to say that this would bring the entire Kenyan economy down, and therefore you couldn't possibly phase down these thin film or out these thin film plastic bags. Public pressure is the only way it's going to happen. What UNEP does, and we regularly do, is we actually provide the global assessments. We provide the evidence, the science, the arguments that you can use in civil society or in parliaments to make this happen. But UNEP is neither mandated nor is it, quite frankly, capable of reaching into that specific set of circumstances. But rest assured, there are a couple of things, and plastic bags are amongst them. If I ever say anything as Executive Director of UNEP, I can guarantee you the largest number of reactions, both vitriolic and fanatically supportive, is around plastic and plastic bags. So UNEP's voice is being heard all the way from California to Japan, to South Africa, and I would simply say this issue of thin film plastic bags is one of those red herrings that people hold up as if your right to carry your vegetables home in a thin film plastic bag is the greatest poverty reduction measure ever invented. It's absurd. Visit Kigali, and what will happen to you at the airport is you're actually freed from your plastic bag. There are no plastic bags that are allowed to be sold in Rwanda. And I must say, I haven't seen Rwanda do worse for it. It's the opposite. So here is the classic inertia, economic interests, arguments that are not rooted either in economics or science, but are just public myth, and they need to be challenged. And we will do our best to continue to feed the public and governments and you as organizations with the analysis and the rationale for acting on this. On the issue of, let me go in reverse order, private sector again. I fully understand when we think about the many terrible instances where a company has done something wrong. And you put it also in terms of, will companies not be always erring on the side of growth versus, sustainable development or environment? I think we are beyond the point where we should classify whole sectors of our society into good or bad. It's not actually the reality. There are companies that are far greater civic citizens than some of our self-proclaimed leaders of society. I have seen it with my own eyes. I'm sure you know them also from your country. Being a private sector actor is not by definition making you into either a good or a bad corporate citizen. I think two things are critical that turn business into either a force for good, if I may use that very prosaic term for a moment, or make them part of the problem and an ever-growing part of the problem. One, I think, is, first of all, an acceptance that businesses are premised on, yes, growing their market, selling their products, making a profit. Now, there may be some amongst you who do not wish to live in a world where profit is made, and that is a choice. But I don't think we can simply, at the moment, say that is the law of our societies. So, producing, wanting to sell more, making a profit, is not illegitimate by definition. Where it becomes a problem is, as you quite rightly pointed out, is where profit begins to be made at the expense of society, of communities, of nature. And I think here we are in the midst of a journey where we need to learn to divide in order to, well, conquer or succeed. And that alliance, I would say to you, is our great strategic challenge right now, because if we can align ourselves with those leaders, and it starts with individuals in business and then it becomes corporate and larger and shareholders and boards and so on, but sometimes it starts with the CEO of a company, to forge alliance and say, how will we change the market in such a way that we can reduce the problem while you can produce and actually provide a service or a product that society wants. Is it impossible? I don't think so. You know, energy efficient lighting. I mean, if it wasn't for the private sector in the end investing in factories and technology development, we wouldn't be able to sit, and I'm now getting very conscious because I don't even know what lighting we use here. But in theory, we could have LED lighting here in this hall. It's terrible, isn't it? I only just realized by looking up that I haven't asked this question in the last 4 years. But I'm not in charge of the United Nations office at Nairobi, so my excuse, but not really. You can produce the same amount of light with 1/15th, 1/20th of the electricity that we needed before. This is the private sector. This is technology at work. This is markets being changed. And that's where prices, because numbers produced go up, prices come down, we suddenly become able to buy this lighting technology. So again, my argument would be, we need to look at how we regulate markets in such a way that businesses cannot make a profit by adding to the problem, but can make a profit and succeed and sell more if they help us to solve problems, or at least provide services that society wants to buy without adding to our problem. And I think here we are seeing in more and more sectors good examples of that, and that is why I would say it is not private sector is in favor of growth at all costs, and somehow a parallel universe is by definition trying the alternative. And that's why, colleagues, again, I would say to you, when we have tried to put so much attention on this notion of moving towards a green economy, it is to recognize how, through legislation, norms, standards, you can begin to shape markets in which businesses succeed that are not harmful to society, and those who wish to continue in that will simply lose their market or their license to operate, or will end up in court. Because it is not just a matter of markets, it's also legislation, enforcement, and where necessary, penalties, imprisonment, whatever it takes. To Marco's point about the information policy, I'm relieved that you consider us on a progressive path. It was a promise we made. I have to be honest with you, I lived in Washington, and you know, some of you were part of that GF and World Bank accountability and advocacy and NGO networks. You know, an institution can create millions of dollars worth of process and then have at least 3 lawyers employed in order to defend itself from things that it didn't think about. What I wanted to, with our colleagues here, and I take personal responsibility because others in UNEP wanted to go much further and faster towards an acceptable policy, I wanted to begin with something that I knew wouldn't give an excuse to a bureaucracy to employ 10 people in order to have an information policy work. Now that was not the intention of what maybe WRI and others and Principle 10 pursue, but that's how bureaucracies then react. So what we put out is something that we could do within the means that are available to us and honor every promise that we would make to you while learning what would we find out that we hadn't thought about, or what would our major groups and stakeholders maybe bring to us that could actually help us make the institution more transparent and accountable and make access to information an effective way of making the institution more transparent. And it would have also taken us with our own legal processes another 6 months to have had even a pilot policy out. So forgive us if those of you who saw it in its first iteration were disappointed, frustrated. We honored our promise that it was a 1-year pilot in which we really did engage, and I want to thank particularly those in the Principle 10 network, and I'll recognize WRI as the particularly eloquent and proactive and sometimes tough comrade, but there were many others also in making sure that we held ourselves to this promise. And I think what we now have is something that actually is close to good international practice. I mean, one can argue what is best international practice, but it's something that this institution can do without spending more money on its own existence and transaction rather than investing in its work. And I want to say this to you because you might say, well, that's a lame excuse. I'm extremely proud to sit here in front of you today, 10 years of my tenure. This organization has reinvented itself in terms of its way of doing business. We almost have double the amount of finance transacted through UNEP in 2015 than we had in 2006. And we have done so with actually less staff than we had in 2006. Now, it's not that I think having less staff is the overriding objective, but I was so fed up, as I'm sure all of you often are, about this notion that the UN only looks after itself and only grows itself in order to, be able to justify itself. I think UNEP deserves extraordinary credit, and it's not my doing, it's actually the staff. It's the partners. It's our clients in many countries around the world who have enabled UNEP to make this extraordinary leap forward by actually shrinking the Secretariat while delivering double the amount of finance invested in the issues that are out there. I don't think that happens very often. And therefore, when I say, even on something like the access to information policy, I was extremely conscious of not starting this whole thing by employing more staff. Today, we may need to employ more staff. We'll learn now in terms of the volume, but it won't be anywhere on what some would have said. Just like evaluators. Well, I want to share this with you, sorry, because it's some of the innards of managing an organization. There are those who will come and evaluate UNEP and say, well, your evaluation office is less than 0. I don't know, X% of your turnover. That means your evaluation function must be very weak. Why are you, suffocating evaluation in UNEP? Why is it that we measure quality by the budget that we allocate to it? We have one of the best evaluation offices in the United Nations system. I say that not, out of some delusional belief. We actually know it from the peer reviews that we have. But it is one of the lowest percentages in terms of turnover taken from the Environment Fund that is allocated to it. Because I've always argued if donors fund projects and they want evaluation of projects and not of UNEP, then that should be part of the budget of the project and not taking money away from the Environment Fund to do global environmental program work. So these are just a couple of illustrations of why sometimes what may sound, Marco, a little bit creative is not totally disingenuous. And the proof, however, as you quite rightly and many of you have said, okay, let's wait a year and then we'll take you to the judgment day. And I have to say I'm relieved that at least you're not saying we have not tried hard enough. I'm sure there are going to be things that we will learn, and UNEP, I think, is extremely open to evolving its access to information policy. On this meeting in New York, I'm actually going to throw something back at you. I don't understand this question, but I comprehend where it's coming from. Why wouldn't, as part of the many hundreds of conversations that UNEP has throughout a calendar year with groups of actors, business, NGOs, mayors, and others, why wouldn't we also try and have a dialogue with some of the biggest players in the conservation and environment field in order to try and understand how we could make the work that UNEP does connect more easily also with some of the incredible work that they do. This was not a stakeholder consultation, in the sense of major groups. This was a very targeted effort to say, guys, why are you sitting on your high horse with all your millions of dollars and 5 of the 12 actually have a larger budget than UNEP, just to put it in perspective. Why are you sitting on your high horse and not try to look at how we can work more hand in hand? There is an IUCN World Conservation Congress coming up. Half of the people who are at UNEA may find themselves in Hawaii. And many other such examples. Shouldn't we look at the calendar year of 2016 as something that, has 2015 behind us, has a UNEP UNEA, has an IUCN World Conservation Congress, has the CITES COP, a CBD COP, a climate COP, and look for connections. So I would simply say to you, it's legitimate to ask the question, but not with the assumption that you're making that there is some sort of, hidden consultation taking place. Inga and I both concluded, IUCN is an umbrella, a membership organization of environment institutions, government agencies, and UNEP with UNEA and this new mandate post-Rio, we said, wouldn't it actually be a good idea to challenge some of our fellow CEOs to come to a table and let's talk about why we continue to operate as if we have two different planets in which we seem to be mandated and put to work. And that was the conversation, and we put out a summary of the paper. I don't know if Mark Haller is here. He can vouch for it, that we did not censor anything in that document. If you're interested in what we discussed, it's available on the internet. And I think it's important that an executive director of UNEP goes out and meets, just as I meet with indigenous peoples, as I meet with people in the finance sector, stock exchange leaders, or ministers in countries where there are some really serious problems. If we did that as some sort of secret plot, you would have, I think, every reason to say, hang on a minute, what's going on here? But it's in the full glare of light, and it is just one more conversation that we had, and that builds a little bridge across to, sorry, I've now jumped over Maureen's point in innovation, but I will come back to it in a moment, Maureen, because it fits in with something I wanted to respond to Peter's observation. First of all, Peter, I want to thank you and many of the faith-based organizations who keep faith with the multilateral process. It's not easy. It's not easy. We in the UN, and I say that in a collective sense, are not always comfortable with religion. Why? I don't think it has anything to do with individual religion or faith. It is just that we are a non-denominational institution. We are founded on a principle that says we cannot affiliate ourselves or be seen to be affiliated with one faith or another. And I think that's an important principle under which to operate. What I think it doesn't justify, and you've seen that with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, with Kofi Annan, with Jim Kim, with Jim Wolfens, and many leaders of international institutions, they have sought the dialogue with faith-based organizations. In my time in UNEP, I've struggled sometimes to understand how could we make that dialogue more than a kind of encounter, and everybody would leave somehow inspired, impressed, but still not figuring out how could these worlds, in a sense, work hand in hand. I think in the last couple of years, well, actually not the last couple of years, for many of you perhaps for longer, it has become quite evident that however much science, technology, economics, human ingenuity, and everything else we can deploy, it is very unlikely that we will make these breakthroughs that we're aiming for if we cannot move beyond that to touch on the normative, the value, the ethical, and there comes very quickly the link also to faith-based movements, communities, whatever the term is we want to use. And I think the year 2015 was very eye-opening. Pope Francis's Laudatio Si was, in a sense, a more articulate formulation of Agenda 2030 than we will ever be able to frame in a negotiated setting. But that's not the most important aspect. I think what it spoke to, and far beyond, that was to me very intriguing, far beyond the Christian or Catholic communities, it spoke to a sense of discomfort, I think, in virtually every human being at the moment, that there is something out of sync. And it is in part related to the value system, our norms, our respect for life. And, just a few days ago we celebrated the festival of Vikas, the birth, life, and death of Buddha. And I was astonished because in this very corridor here, ambassadors, permanent representatives, were suddenly talking about environment and development and Buddha's life and teachings in ways that I wish we could hear this coming week in the halls of the United Nations Environment Assembly. And some of them were actually talking as Christians about the teachings of Buddha. And I would urge you, if you have a moment, just to study, perhaps Laudatio Si, what is said on Vikas, when Vikas is celebrated, and in many other faiths. And when we organized, at the invitation of Iran, the second international seminar on environment, culture, and religion, it was, I think, for us also a very deliberate decision to follow the invitation of Minister Ebtekhar to Tehran, because in the world in which we live right now, for many people, that would be perhaps the most unexpected location for having such a seminar. And together with UNESCO, our Iranian colleagues, and many of you who attended, I think we had a profoundly inspiring dialogue, and one that I hope will find its way to evolve further in the ecosystem of UNEP and UNEA. There I have to count a little bit more on those of you who come from the faith-based communities, because I think a bureaucracy and an intergovernmental process is semi-literate when it comes to threading the needle for such a discussion to move forward. But there is enormous demand, I sense, and an enormous yearning for that to become part of the way we think about the future. And Maureen, that is my loop back to your point about innovation. I think the private sector universe looks at innovation in two ways. Innovation can be a competitive advantage and therefore is just the next generation of doing better in the marketplace, outcompeting my competitors. And innovation can be, I think, very often also tied to this notion that we don't want to continue doing things because of what we now know it is causing. And therefore innovation becomes as much a corporate strategic ambition as I think it speaks to people who work in business. And in UNEP, we are, living a schizophrenic life, because intergovernmental processes today are rarely innovative, although then they achieve these breakthroughs, and perhaps it is a mythical formula that allows it to happen from time to time. But what I would share with you is, and I think this is where UNEA could set an example, is that far too much of what is today multilateralism is defined not by the opportunity of innovation and what can be done together, but by the scars, the frustrations, and the disappointments with the past. New York, to me, often is a symbol of nations that have lost their view of what the United Nations was actually established for. And in the absence of it being the force for progressive policy-making, leadership, and so on, it becomes an arena for mutual retribution. And quite frankly, every country has sufficient reason to sulk with another group of countries to make this a very sustainable business. Unfortunately, it's killing the faith of the public in multilateralism. And so if UNEA can demonstrate that in good faith and with goodwill, we take facts seriously, we are guided by science and empirical evidence, and based on that, we don't take differences and disagreements as reasons to criticize each other or demonize each other, but actually to recognize that that is precisely why there is a United Nations and a United Nations Environment Assembly, in order to overcome those differences, which are legitimate very often. Then I think innovation suddenly becomes possible. And again, I would say to you, if you look at the work that we now do on green finance, just to take one example, or on renewable energy, sustainable transport, ecosystem-based adaptation, very often we have enjoyed in UNEP and in our governing bodies a degree of confidence and trust by governments to allow us to experiment with new approaches and to foster and cultivate and catalyze innovation. And then at a certain point it takes off, and UNEP becomes either a companion or an exclamation mark in history, but the force of evidence propels the agenda forward. And I think business has as much to gain and to claim that agenda of innovation as do civil society organizations. Some of the greatest ideas today that are also shaping markets and economies have their origins in people who had nothing to do with economics and business. Mahatma Gandhi, Wangari Maathai, the people who invented the solar energy revolution. And I think that, to me, is why UNEA, and let me say this to you, because this is going to be a difficult week in some respects for all of us, because there are some hot issues on the agenda. Why all of us need to protect UNEA. You know, this assembly has been born. You know, this is the second one, and just by sheer interest and engagement, I think it has taken already its next leap forward. But UNEA needs to be built, and you will, as major groups, be as central to this as are the government delegates here. And even if, you know, the formalities, and I don't want to diminish them, of the rules of procedure and the stakeholder engagement policy give conflicting signals, I can tell you genuinely that I think there is not a single government here that does not know how important you are to this process. And when we are going to debate the procedural issues on stakeholder engagement, the reasons why they're still being debated in 3 different sections have nothing to do with what you have brought to this assembly. They have to do with the politics of the world that we can't always pretend do not impact also what happens here. So bear that in mind, because I know that you're going to throw us out now. That as you engage this week here, you are part of UNEA. You are UNEA. Without you, UNEA would not be UNEA. Yes, you will have battles, you will have setbacks, and you will not always have every government agree with what it is that you as major groups may wish it to do, or what they feel they're able to do. But not for a second doubt that the tradition that this organization has built over 4 decades is in any way in question, that you are part of the environmental governance process, and without you it wouldn't be here. And I'm reminded just a few weeks ago when a minister in a parliament in Europe said, colleagues, I just want to take one moment and thank the many environmentalists who have often given their life and time and were never recognized for what we now just take as given and normal. And your predecessors, and hopefully you, will continue that tradition. Thank you.
Colleagues, Mr. Achim Steiner has addressed us rather for the last time. And on behalf of the Major Group Facilitating Committee, I want to acknowledge his work over the last 10 years in guiding the UNEP and the United Nations Environment Agency to the point where we are. So if you would honor me by acknowledging and congratulating and thanking Mr. Steiner for the work that he did over the last 10 years. Thank you very much, colleagues. And this session has now come to an end. I pass over to my colleague who will take us through the end of today's long meeting.
Yes, it was indeed a very long day, but I think it was an interesting day. I'm not going to make a summary of the day, so don't be worried about that. It's just to say that tomorrow we will start at 9, same room. We will start with our thematic clusters. So if you have any idea, or if you want to lead a cluster or a thematic working group, I must say, also late for me and jet lag and so, then please approach us, so then we can already make a kind of list of the working groups we will have tomorrow morning, so we don't have to figure that out at 9. So that's one. And the other thing is we had the brown bag lunch meeting. I saw a lot of hands of people that were new, and I asked for business cards, because it's absolutely necessary that you're on my list, on the UNEA list, to be informed on what's happening during this week. So if I received only 5, maybe you're not interested, but if you want to be updated on the process, what's going on next week, then please give me your business card so I can add you on the UNEA list. And then I think most of you will go to the event on the fashion, what was it? The title? the Fashioning Rural Women's Self-Empowerment event. So I think the taxis are waiting outside. It's at 7, so that's more or less now. Okay, I think that was it for today, and see you all tomorrow. Thank you.